I'm Marcy Norton. I'm in the history department at the University of Pennsylvania.
How big a problem is this for the history profession?
I think it's a problem. I don't think we actually fully know the extent of it right now. I think the anonymous survey that Karen Kelsky administered suggests it's a very, very extensive problem. I know informally from my own network, which is obviously anecdotal, not representative, I know people who have been harassed and denied tenure. I know people who have been raped. And most of us have had various forms of minor incidents that are not life-changing, but it has been life-changing. And I think it really needs to be emphasized that this results in trauma for individuals, but it also is a horrible loss for the profession, and it affects it profoundly because these are voices who have not been heard, who are not publishing when they should be publishing, who are not teaching when they should be teaching, and so it's a problem. And I think it is really important for us to be able to more rigorously answer that question, what the extent of it is. I, along with a group of other historians who we've now named ourselves the Feminist Historians Collective, and we're inclusive and encourage people to join us, wrote a letter in November in the aftermath of the Weinstein-Gate Me Too moment, asking the AHA to take on this issue. And we circulated it on social media, and I'll say, not with a huge amount of intensity, but nonetheless, within 2 days, 750 of our colleagues had signed the letter. So I was invited in my capacity as having helped get that ball rolling.
My name is Norton and Schultheiss. I'm associate professor at George Washington University. I'm the chair of the history department there, and I'm also I'm the chair of the AHA's Committee on Gender Equity.
How big a problem is sexual harassment in the history profession?
That's an important question. It's one we don't actually have an answer to yet. However, the AHA Council has decided to conduct a survey on the extent to which this is a problem, and we're using a survey that was recently devised by the Political Science Association, the APSA, I guess, and they sent out a survey recently that had a series of questions about the extent of sexual harassment defined in various different ways. It's quite specific, and they got some very interesting results, and I think next week there's an article being published on their results, and with their permission, the AHA is going to be sending out a very similar survey so that we can figure out what exactly we're talking about here.
And who's going to get the survey?
Everyone who's a member of the American Historical Association, so all members, and that's many thousands of people.
And what kind of questions are you going to be asking?
So I don't remember the exact question, but they're not a lot of questions, but it has to do with, have you ever experienced X behavior, Y behavior, Z behavior, or these kinds of comments, or discrimination of various kinds, and in what settings have you experienced them?
Is it kind of a checklist, or can they actually contribute a written statement saying this happened to me, or I know this happened to a colleague?
That I don't know, and I think there's going to be an option for comments, but I don't. The actual survey hasn't been formalized yet, and I think the AHA wanted, on the one hand, to keep it as similar to the political science survey as possible so that they can do some kind of comparative statistics to see to what extent this is pervasive in these two disciplines, or whether there's something specific about history as opposed to political science. And the hope, I think, is that other disciplines, other professional associations, disciplinary based, will also do a very similar survey so that then we can see, this is particularly a problem in history, or it's not particularly a problem in history, but it's pervasive throughout the disciplines.
Do you have an idea when the survey will be distributed?
Soon. I'm guessing but I don't have a date, but I'm guessing it's going to go out shortly after the convention ends or within the next few weeks, because we want it to, for people who just came from the convention, where it's on their mind, this issue, which was fairly prominent at this particular conference. One of the things that's important to understand is that the AHA is very aware that it only controls certain venues, and one of the biggest one is the convention itself, right? The annual meeting, and so any kind of decisions that it makes about policy can only be actually implemented and enforced at the convention and in its own offices. So with that in mind, it makes sense to have this survey go out around the time of the convention. But there's a lot of logistical things that have to be in place in order for that survey to go out. So it could be a few weeks. I don't actually know.
One grad student, a man, stood up toward the end, and he noted that there weren't all that many men in the audience. Was that distressing? I mean, you had a large crowd of about 75
Right.
people.
Yes,
Most of them were women.
I'll say it is distressing. I was not surprised. And I think we so much expect that I had people say to me, like, oh, look, there's some men. Like, that's like a sort of miracle. So, but I think that it is actually deeply distressing and very revealing.
Can the problem be fixed without the engagement of men?
Not in the status quo, because men continue to dominate the power structures in our profession. So short of a grassroots revolution in history, which I don't exactly even know what that looks like, because we are a higher. So I have to think about my first instinct is to say no. That it's going to require, and as was also emphasized, this does adversely affect men on many levels. I mean, there are men who are victims of sexual harassment. I would also say it's not beneficial to men to be in a world that encourages their harassment for their own emotional, intellectual, and professional fulfillment. So women are disproportionately affected, but this is a blight for all of us.
My name is Laura Mitchell, and I'm an associate professor of history at the University of California in Irvine.
How big a problem is sexual harassment?
Sexual harassment in the academy is a big problem, and I think we tend to look the other way too often. There may not be as many spectacular cases as we've been seeing in media and politics, but it's low-level, day-to-day occurrences of subjecting women to different kinds of treatment, passing off jokes or comments as okay or plausible when it really makes the workplace uncomfortable for women, for people of color, for people of multiple gender identities. It's not just a sexual harassment, but an inclusiveness question.
Any specific examples you can think of, without naming names, that really strike home?
I think one of the things that really came out in the panel that just happened on sexual harassment in the history profession is things that I think many of us thought had gone by the wayside of making people really uncomfortable in job interviews, particularly or the conference interviews that end up happening in hotel rooms rather than suites or public spaces, ways in which job candidates get put one-on-one with people on the search committee, whether that's being picked up in a car, being driven on a tour. I think in some cases these may not be instances where the individual is trying to make the other person uncomfortable, but it happens, right? And because there is this pervasive undercurrent of power inequity between men and women, between heteronormative white men and a lot of other characteristics or constituencies, the people in those spaces feel uncomfortable. And we need to do more to make everyone aware. And I think one of the other things that came out really importantly in the conversation we just had on the panel was the significance of allies and of bystanders being able to speak up, and all of us having language to say, you know what, that's not okay, or that's a pattern that we may have accepted without thinking, and now that we're thinking, let's change our behavior.
After the panel finished talking, one of the people in the audience stood up and observed that it wasn't a really huge crowd I counted about 75 people there. I guess his expectation was there would be hundreds, given the prominence of this issue in the national news. Were you disappointed?
Actually, I wasn't at all disappointed. First of all, this was what we call a late breaking session, which means it wasn't in the printed program at all. So if you went, it was because you found it in the online program. You didn't know it only was created a few weeks ago. So it's only people who you would have had to stumble upon it or gotten a tweet or something about this panel. So I'm very pleased with the turnout. 75 or however many were there seems like a very respectable number. They're also, I know that person complained about the time of day that was offered, but it's actually a pretty prime spot. You don't have to get up early to go to a 10:30 session. But as a result, there are lots of competing sessions, and there are many concurrent sessions. So people have to choose, and some people left after a little while because they had another session to go to. So no, I wasn't disappointed at all.
Final question. Did any of the people who stood up and told stories really affect you? Any stick in your mind?
Well, I was actually struck, and often what strikes you most is something that resonates personally because you experienced it. And the one person who spoke up and said that she found the tours of the community that often accompanied a job search, where usually a single member of the search committee, usually the chair of the search committee, drives a job candidate around the community in their car to show them, what it's like to live in this town or city or what have you. And she said that was the setting in which she often experienced, some very inappropriate questions being asked or statements being made. And that's something that I've actually experienced, that once you're out of the interviews and you're off campus and there's sort of this sense of we're just two people in a car, that's when you get questions about, so what does your husband do? Do you have a husband? What about your kids? What are you planning to, those kinds of questions which you're actually not supposed to ask at an interview get asked in that setting. And the job candidate is in a position where you can't really, if you say, I prefer not to answer that question, you feel that sort of puts you at a disadvantage for a job that you probably want. So that was one thing that stuck in my mind as something that hadn't occurred to me before, but yeah, that happens.